One thing I want to talk about too is the idea of understanding of death across the lifespan. So sort of the way that children and adolescents perceive and understand death and how that evolves or matures as people get older. And understanding death really requires that you understand these 5 sort of basic concepts. And different age periods struggle with different pieces of these. So one of the concepts of death is non-functionality. So the idea that, once you die, your body functions all cease to function. Finality, so the idea that once someone dies, there's no way for them to come back. It's a final thing. Universality is the concept that everyone will die at some point. Applicability is how death, only something that is alive can die. So, I'll talk about it in a minute. Some kids may have a false belief that, like a inanimate object is capable of death, but only something that's living is capable of death. And then ideas of causation. So the fact that, death results from failure of the body, which can come from a variety of external and internal sources. So understanding all 5 of those aspects is really key to understand the concept of death as a whole. And so young kids may struggle with some aspects of that understanding. It partially depends on basic notions of biology. So if they understand, just basic things that the body is made of different organs, some of those organs are really necessary for the function of the body to continue, right? Like you need a heartbeat, you need to be breathing in order to be alive. If they understand those biological concepts, then it's easier for them to understand the death as a whole. Most will attain an adult-like understanding of all 5 of those concepts by age 6 or so. And that's true even if they haven't necessarily experienced death themselves, if they haven't had like a pet or a family member pass away. And so, really at a pretty young age, most children are capable of understanding all these concepts of death. Some may struggle to understand finality. So whenever someone passes away, they may think, for example, that they're asleep and that they're going to wake up eventually. They also may struggle with concepts of universality. So they may come to realize, that death is final, but they may think that they are not going to die, or that the people that they love and care about the most are not going to die. And so that universality concept can also be something that they struggle with. In our culture, we tend to be very death avoidant, meaning that it's not something we talk about very frequently, especially with children. That's not true of all cultures. So, for example, in Mexico, it's very common to talk openly about death and to emphasize sort of celebrating the life of people who have passed away. So they have holidays like Dia de los Muertos. I don't know why I can't say that right now. It's a holiday that we maybe associate kind of with Halloween. It has similar sort of traditions as Halloween, but it's more geared at celebrating the life of those who have passed away. And so it's been shown that people in those cultures that are more open to talking about death, they tend to have less anxiety about dying, and they have a better understanding of those concepts that I talk about. Experience with death does affect understanding to some extent. So, I just said that even by age 6, most children can understand it, even if they haven't had an experience with death. But if someone has an experience with death at a really early age, around 3 or 4, then that can kind of accelerate, especially the understanding of finality, that idea that when something or someone dies, they're not going to come back. Candid, sensitive discussion with adults. So a lot of adults, I think, have the view that they shouldn't talk to kids about death because kids don't understand it. But most research it negates that idea and suggests that really children, again, at a really young age, understand death. And that it can actually be really helpful to talk to them about it, can help reduce some of the anxieties that they have, can help them deal with grief if someone that passes, that they know does pass away. So by adolescence, I said by age 6, most people have a pretty good understanding of those 5 concepts, and definitely by adolescence, people understand most of sort of the logical ideas of death. But there are some kind of interesting things that happen in adolescence in regards to this. So some adolescents may have difficulty integrating sort of some logic about death with reality. We've talked quite a bit about how adolescents tend to engage in more risky behavior, and that's due to social context, changes in the brains, all kinds of things that are going on at that period. But because of that, so a lot of teenagers may engage in a risky behavior that could potentially result in death, something like reckless driving, for example. And if they do that and then they come out of it, with no consequences, they survive it, there's no injuries or anything, they sometimes can develop this sort of illusion of control over death and over reality. So they may feel like, I'm not capable of dying, I've done all these things and nothing bad has happened to me. And so they may have this sort of cycle of escalating risky behavior because they've sort of lived through risky things before. And so they're more likely to engage in these death-defying acts that are kind of illogical, even though they have good understanding of all those concepts of death that I talked about. And just like in childhood, having conversations about death during this time helps to promote understanding, helps to reduce some of those risky behaviors and death-defying acts. And so I think throughout all of development, it's important to be open to talking about death, not necessarily maybe to like obsess over it or talk about it, to an abnormal degree, but to at least be open to talking about it when it's relevant. Some ways that discussing death with children and adolescents can be more successful. One is to take the lead. So especially if there has been some sort of death-related incident, maybe a family member has passed away, maybe there's been a close encounter where someone was close to dying, then it's important to really be intuitive, or to try to intuit the children's emotions and to speak up and talk about death even if they don't really seem to want to. Listening perceptively, making sure you're paying attention to everything that they're saying, paying attention to their emotions and feelings, acknowledging and validating their feelings, letting them know that grief and sadness are all completely normal, acceptable, reasonable things to feel, and making them feel like their feelings and emotions are just as important and valid as an adult's. Providing facts candidly, so being open and honest again about death, about what happens, about the finality of it, about all those issues. I mean, that can be done with cultural sensitivity, so paying attention to the religious beliefs of the family, making sure that you incorporate those into the way that you talk about death. Also engaging in what's called joint problem solving, so especially if children have a question that doesn't have like a solid answer, right? Like if a child asks, what happens to your soul when you pass away? There's obviously religious beliefs, you can share with them about that, but it's been shown that they often can cope better if you give them the autonomy to sort of come to their own conclusions through the joint problem solving. So this just kind of summarizes then how adults tend to view and understand death. So through early adulthood, most people tend to avoid talking about death and have pretty high death anxiety. So they fear death, they look at it as something obviously negative. Most early adults have fairly limited exposure to death. They maybe haven't had a large number of family members pass away. And so they often consider death to be distant. They don't really feel sort of a personal connection to death during that phase. Through middle adulthood, the concept starts to become more concrete and personally relevant. People shift, like I said, all of you probably think of your age in terms of how long you've been alive, whereas around middle adulthood you start to shift towards how much time do I have left, and so you start to focus on tasks that need to be completed before death, and become more aware of limited time left to live. That's particularly true if you're starting to have physical and mental declines that kind of signify like, okay, I'm declining now instead of gaining or growing. And by late adulthood, most people start to think and talk a lot more about death. They're very much more open to talking about it. They start to experience increasing evidence. Again, their own physical and mental capacities start to suffer. They also are more likely to start suffering from loss of loved ones. By that time, most people's parents would have passed away. You may have siblings and cousins, things like that, passing away. And so all of that starts to make it much more obvious that the death is inevitable. And so they shift towards this more practical concern with, like we talked about, what do I want to do with my body? What do I want my funeral to be like? Some of those more logistical concerns. And death anxiety is much less pronounced during late adulthood compared to these other periods.